They called it madness before they understood it. 100 tons of bananas hauled into the Sahel, buried under heat so fierce it could melt steel. Not for profit, not for propaganda, for something more dangerous: independence. In a continent where aid had become another word for control, Burkina Faso was rewriting the vocabulary. No loans, no conditions, no dependence disguised as generosity. And the world noticed when President Ibrahim Traoré took the stage at the United Nations General Assembly in September 2025. He did not come to thank donors. He came to end an era. "We will feed ourselves," he said. "The aid era is over." There was no applause at first, just the sound of translation headsets clicking and chairs shifting in the marble hall. For decades, African leaders had come to ask for help. Traoré had come to refuse it. Weeks earlier, satellite images had shown convoys crossing the Sahel, trucks packed not with weapons or grain, but with fruit bound for burial. Analysts marked it as waste. Economists called it reckless. But to those who understood the language of power, it was something else entirely: a declaration of sovereignty written in soil. Because in Burkina Faso's calculus, freedom does not arrive in envelopes or aid packages. It is cultivated from the ground up. And as those first bananas disappeared beneath the sand, a question began to rattle the old order. If a nation can feed its soil without permission, what else might it stop asking for? If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not leave. Like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe, not for us, but to keep the flame of dignity burning. For more than half a century, Africa had fed the world. Its cocoa sweetened foreign desserts. Its cotton clothed distant cities. Its gold and oil powered empires. Yet the hands that harvested plenty often returned home empty. The paradox was cruel and precise. The continent that nourished others could not feed itself. The dream of independence, once written in blood and songs, was quietly rewritten in contracts and aid programs. Since the late 20th century, the so-called Green Revolution had promised to end hunger. It brought hybrid seeds, imported fertilizers, and Western consultants who spoke of modernization. But the price of progress was dependency. By 2024, sub-Saharan Africa was spending more than $7.6 billion a year on imported agricultural inputs. In Burkina Faso alone, $280 million vanished annually to pay for synthetic fertilizers, chemicals that arrived on foreign ships and left farmers in debt. The soil itself had become a hostage. Fields that once yielded freely now required constant feeding from abroad. Each harvest demanded more imports, more loans, more surrender. The Green Revolution had turned into a quiet addiction, and the dealers wore suits. Ibrahim Traoré understood this better than most. A soldier by training, he had seen hunger stalk his own troops more effectively than any enemy. When he took power in 2022, amid political upheaval, he inherited a nation exhausted by drought, by debt, by decades of dependency disguised as partnership. Yet in his first national address, he said something few dared to imagine. "Our soil is our first army. When it dies, no gun can save us." His vision was not of bullets or borders, but of self-sufficient land. He believed that sovereignty was not merely a flag or a speech at the United Nations. It was the ability to feed one's people without asking permission. By early 2025, that belief had hardened into policy. Alongside Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso withdrew from ECOWAS on the 29th of January 2025 and joined the newly formed Alliance of Sahel States, ASS, a coalition built not on aid, but on autonomy. It was a political break with the old order and a moral declaration to the world. The Sahel would no longer kneel for survival. And yet, Traoré's next move seemed almost insane. Instead of signing trade deals or inviting foreign investors, he ordered trucks to collect ripe bananas from markets, warehouses, and farms. Thousands of pounds of fruit, a nation's food, were loaded into convoys bound for the desert. Under the burning Sahel sun, the trucks rolled out from Ouagadougou like a funeral procession. To many, it looked like the burial of reason itself. By early 2025, that belief had hardened into steel. And what came next would make the world question everything it thought it knew about power, soil, and freedom. The political break had been decisive. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger withdrew from ECOWAS on the 29th of January 2025, they were not merely leaving a regional bloc. They were rejecting a system. The Alliance of Sahel States, formed on the 16th of September 2023, had begun as a military pact against jihadists. By 2025, it had evolved into something deeper, a coalition for economic autonomy. No more aid packages with strings attached.
No more dependency dressed as development. The Sahel would stand on its own soil, literally. But Traoré's next move defied logic. Instead of trade agreements or foreign investment, he gave an order that left even his closest advisors speechless. Collect the bananas. Thousands of pounds of ripe fruit, golden, soft, ready to be eaten, were hauled from markets and warehouses across Burkina Faso. Farmers watched in confusion as military trucks arrived to take what they had grown. "Where are they going?" villagers asked. "To the desert," came the answer. Under the scorching Sahel sun, the convoys rolled out from Ouagadougou like a funeral procession. The trucks moved slowly, laboring under the weight of fruit and heat. Children ran alongside, laughing at first, then falling silent as the enormity of the act became clear. This was not a harvest. It was a burial. Villagers lined the roads in silence. Some laughed in disbelief. Others whispered, "Our president has lost his mind." But those who knew Ibrahim Traoré saw something else. They saw the same defiance that had carried him through years of rebellion, the same unshakable belief that had brought him to power. Traoré was not burying food, he was burying dependence. The Western press mocked him. "A banana republic burying bananas," one headline sneered from Paris. In Washington, policy analysts dismissed it as agricultural populism, a dangerous experiment that would destabilize aid programs and undermine Western supply chains. Editorial cartoons showed Traoré as a madman, shoveling fruit into the sand while his people starved. Yet within Burkina Faso, something deeper stirred. The act was absurd, yes, but also strangely poetic. The banana, once the symbol of exploitation, of plantations and foreign ownership, was now being turned into a weapon of liberation. Even his critics sensed it. This was not an experiment in agriculture. It was an experiment in identity. The people of Burkina Faso had spent decades being told what to plant, what to buy, what to believe. Now their leader was telling them to trust their own soil again. The same fruit that had long mocked their history was being buried to rewrite it. Some called it Project Green Pulse. Others simply called it madness. But for Traoré, it was a declaration of war. Not against nations, but against the idea that Africa could not stand on its own feet. At this point, I want to invite you into something bigger than watching. Leave a thank you in the comments. It might be "Thank you, Traoré," or "Thank you, Burkina Faso," or simply "Thank you for hope." Why? Because each thank you carries weight. Each thank you says, "I hear this, I feel this, I stand with this." Imagine hundreds of people adding their thanks. It turns a video into a movement. So write your thank you now and let your voice be part of this shared journey. "We are not burying food," he told his cabinet in a late-night meeting, his voice steady, his eyes tired but resolute. "We are planting freedom." And as the last truck disappeared into the horizon, swallowed by the shimmering heat of the desert, a question hung in the air like smoke. If sovereignty begins with the soil, what happens when the soil itself starts to fight back? At first, the plan sounded like a riddle wrapped in dust. Why bury food in a land of hunger? Why send ripe bananas into the desert when children still went to bed with empty stomachs? The questions came fast and furious, from journalists, from farmers, from mothers standing in markets with empty baskets. But Ibrahim Traoré's reasoning ran deeper than pity or politics. It was science and symbolism woven together into a single audacious bet. Each banana, he explained, was a capsule of life, rich in potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, and carbon, the very elements missing from the Sahel's exhausted soil. Over decades of chemical farming and desertification, the land had lost its biological pulse. It could no longer breathe, no longer retain water, no longer sustain its people. But nature, if given back its own waste, could heal itself. The idea was not born in a laboratory, but in observation. Across Brazil's semi-arid northeast and India's Deccan Plateau, scientists had experimented with compost derived from banana peels and organic waste. Their results were astonishing. Yields increased by up to 40%. Fertilizer costs were cut in half. And microbial life, the invisible workforce of the earth, multiplied exponentially. Burkina Faso's agronomists studied those findings and saw a reflection of their own struggle. If the soil could be revived without imported chemicals, then the nation could reclaim its freedom, not through war, but through biology. And so, the desert became a laboratory. Under the supervision of military engineers and environmental scientists, trenches were dug across hundreds of acres of barren land outside Dori and Kaya. 2,000 acres in total, stretching like scars across the ochre Sahel. Each trench was layered with decomposing bananas, crop residue, and microbial activators, the building blocks of regeneration. From above, drones recorded surreal footage, the endless ochre sands of the Sahel streaked with ribbons of gold, banana skins glinting beneath the sun. It looked absurd, almost cinematic, like a ritual from another age. Yet for those who stood there, sweat dripping, shovels sinking into hot dust, it felt sacred. An elder farmer, watching from a distance, murmured, "We used to bury our dead here. Now we bury hope so it can rise again." Ibrahim Traoré visited the site days later. Surrounded by soldiers and scientists, he knelt and placed the final fruit into the earth with his own hands. The cameras captured the moment. The president of a nation, dirt under his fingernails, planting not a seed but a statement. "Let them laugh," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. They laughed at every nation before it stood. That moment marked the official birth of Project Green Pulse, a name chosen to signify the heartbeat returning to the soil. But it was more than an agricultural project. It was an act of rebellion dressed as renewal. For decades, the world had dictated Africa's progress in the language of dependency. Aid, grants, imports, partnerships. Ibrahim Traoré had chosen another language entirely, the language of life itself. The project's goals were as audacious as its symbolism. Within 6 months, scientists aimed to convert 2,000 acres of desert into arable land using nothing but decomposing fruit and microbial compost. If successful, it would reduce the nation's fertilizer imports by at least 30%, saving tens of millions annually. But the deeper ambition was psychological. The first land we must decolonize, Traoré told a gathering of farmers in Kaya, is the one beneath our feet. To the outside world, the experiment looked like a stunt. To Burkina Faso, it was a statement, a declaration that sovereignty could grow, literally, from the ground up. Villagers gathered at the edges of the desert, watching the trucks unload their golden cargo. Children clapped and sang, others whispered prayers. No one truly understood what would happen next. And as dusk fell over the Sahel, the scent of overripe fruit mingled with hot dust, a strange, almost holy smell. Somewhere beneath that sand, millions of tiny organisms began their silent work, breaking down sweetness into strength. No one could see it yet, but life had begun to move again under the surface. They said we were burying food, Traoré told his advisors that night, standing alone on a ridge overlooking the trenches. The wind whipped his shirt. The stars burned cold and clear above. But what we're really burying is fear. Outside, the desert wind carried his words away, as if the earth itself were listening. For 3 long weeks, nothing happened. The desert lay still, a flat, unbroken expanse of silence. The buried bananas decomposed unseen, hidden beneath layers of sand and heat. The sun scorched the air. The wind offered no answers. And the critics grew louder. On radio talk shows in Ouagadougou, traders mocked the government. "They bury food while people starve," one shouted, his voice sharp with anger. Market vendors shook their heads. Farmers laughed bitterly. "Bananas can't grow millet," an old man spat into the dust. Even within the government, doubts began to creep in. Ministers asked quiet questions. Advisors exchanged worried glances. Had the president gone too far this time? Had his defiance crossed the line into delusion? But Ibrahim Traoré did not waver. He visited the site every few days, walking the trenches in silence, his boots crunching on dry earth. He would kneel, press his palm to the sand, and wait, as if listening for something only he could hear. "Give it time," he told his cabinet. "The soil does not lie." And then, in the 4th week, something impossible happened. A whisper of green appeared where no green had lived for years. A single shoot, thin as a finger, trembling in the wind. Then another, and another. By the end of the week, dozens of tiny millet and sorghum sprouts pierced the sand like defiant flags. Their leaves pale but alive, their roots reaching down into soil that had been declared dead. The desert, once a graveyard of dust, began to breathe again. Villagers came running. Mothers brought their children to see what they called the miracle field. An old man knelt, crumbling the earth between his hands, astonished by its new texture, soft, dark, alive. "This land was dead," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Now it smells like rain." The news spread faster than wildfire. Drone footage captured impossible images. Emerald veins snaking across the ochre Sahel, threading through the sand like life returning to a corpse. Television anchors called it the desert that eats bananas and grows crops. Newspapers that had once ridiculed the project now carried front-page photos of children watering fragile green stems beneath the same sun that had once burned everything to ash. The people began to name the fields: the Garden of Hope, Banana Nation, the Fields of Golden Seeds. Each name carried a weight of meaning, a reclaiming of narrative. Teachers brought students to witness the phenomenon firsthand. Science classes turned into pilgrimages. Children planted their own banana peels in the sand, singing a new song they had made up themselves. "We feed the desert so the desert can feed us." Something extraordinary was happening, not only to the land, but to the spirit of a nation. In a country long defined by scarcity, laughter returned to the sound of work. People no longer asked, "Will this work?" but rather, "What else can we do?" Agronomists measured the results with instruments and spreadsheets, but the numbers only confirmed what everyone could already see. Soil fertility up 60%. Microbial activity up 300%. Organic matter levels rising for the first time in recorded history. The science was undeniable. But the transformation that truly mattered could not be measured in numbers. It was in the faces of the farmers who once knelt in defeat and now knelt in wonder. A reporter from Accra asked one of them what had changed. The man smiled, a rare thing in those days, and said, "Maybe the land was never dead. Maybe we were." The line struck the nation like scripture. That night, in a national broadcast, Ibrahim Traoré addressed the country again. No suit, no teleprompter, just the glow of a kerosene lamp behind him, casting long shadows across his face. "They told us our soil was worthless," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But look, it only needed us to believe in it again. We buried fruit, but maybe what we really buried was our fear. If we can make the desert live, what else can we bring back to life?" That question hung in the air, heavier than any policy or plan. It was not just about bananas anymore. It was about a nation rediscovering its pulse. The quiet rhythm of people who had finally stopped waiting for salvation and started creating it. And somewhere in the wind that swept across the Sahel that night, you could almost hear it. The heartbeat of a continent returning from the dead. Take a second, right here, to tell us where you are watching from. Type the name of your city, your land, the soil beneath your feet. And as you do, know this: One Nation Africa sends you not just thanks, but a blessing. For strength in your hands, for pride in your heart, for light on the road ahead. The comments below become a map of connection, showing that this message reaches far beyond borders. Something extraordinary was happening, not only to the land, but to the spirit of a nation. And the world was about to take notice. 6 weeks after the first green shoots appeared, the desert was no longer silent. And neither were the boardrooms of Europe. In late March 2025, a 68-page confidential memo leaked from a European trade consortium, sending shockwaves through global agriculture circles. The subject line was blunt: Risk Assessment, Burkina Faso Organic Fertilizer Threat. Buried within its cautious language was panic. The document warned that if Project Green Pulse spread across the Sahel, demand for imported chemical fertilizers could collapse by 37% within a decade. Profit margins would evaporate, supply chains would fracture, entire markets would disappear. If this spreads, one executive wrote in a margin note, "We lose the continent." It was the first admission that a few thousand buried bananas might topple a $210 billion industry. The reaction was immediate. In Paris, a leading newspaper ran a headline dripping with sarcasm: "Banana Republic, literally." Editorial cartoons showed Ibrahim Traoré as a clown juggling fruit while his nation starved. Op-eds warned that unregulated organic methods could threaten global food security, a familiar argument whenever profits trembled. In Washington, think tanks called Traoré's policy agricultural populism, warning that such experiments could destabilize aid programs and undermine Western supply chains. Diplomatic cables hinted at quiet pressure. Development agencies delayed funding for unrelated Sahel infrastructure projects, citing policy uncertainty. The message was clear: independence comes at a cost. But across the global south, the tone was electric. In Moscow, commentators hailed the project as a revolution born from scarcity, proof that the old order was crumbling. State television broadcast footage of the miracle fields, narrated with barely concealed satisfaction. Here was Africa, they said, refusing to beg.
In Beijing, officials proposed a $450 million organic sovereignty partnership with Burkina Faso, citing it as proof that ecological independence could be a new path to development. Chinese agronomists arrived in Ouagadougou offering technical support, soil testing equipment, and microbial research. And in Ankara, Turkish media praised the initiative as human-centered science rooted in indigenous wisdom. President Erdogan sent a personal letter to Traoré calling him a leader who understands that true power grows from the earth. Suddenly, what had begun as compost was becoming geopolitics. Trade journals in Brussels warned investors of disruptive risk from African organic innovation. Lobbyists urged governments to monitor developments in the Sahel, a phrase that sounded harmless until you remembered how often monitoring had preceded interference. For decades, Africa had been told that progress required imported fertilizer, patented seeds, and foreign loans, a dependence marketed as generosity. The so-called Green Revolution of the 1960s had turned India into a grain powerhouse, but at a price: toxic runoff, depleted groundwater, and farmers trapped in debt. Burkina Faso's Green Pulse offered something radically different: a revolution of restoration, not extraction. They taught us to buy life in bags, one Burkina Faso agronomist told reporters from Dakar. Now we are learning to grow it again. Inside Burkina Faso, the mood shifted from pride to defiance. Farmers began calling the decomposed fruit Africa's green gold. Market vendors sold sacks of Sahelian compost marked with a simple logo: a golden banana split open like a sunrise. To buy it was no longer merely to garden, it was to vote. Economists calculated that even if only 1/3 of imported fertilizer was replaced by local compost, the nation could save $45 million per year. Money that could fund irrigation systems, rural schools, and agricultural research instead of shipping profits overseas. But outside Burkina Faso, fear spread faster than hope. The fertilizer giants saw not soil, but sabotage. A French CEO, speaking at an industry conference in Lyon, warned that unregulated organic methods could create long-term instability in global food systems. It was the same language used decades earlier to defend pesticides, monocultures, and debt-financed development. By April, the pressure had become diplomatic. Western embassies began asking careful questions about agricultural governance and quality control standards. Aid packages came with new conditions. Loans were quietly withheld. The machinery of influence, long hidden beneath the language of partnership, was now operating in plain sight. Still, Ibrahim Traoré refused to retreat. In a televised address in early May, he stared straight into the camera, his voice low and steady, and said, "When we stop importing what we can create, they call it rebellion. So be it." His words landed like thunder across the Sahel. Murals appeared overnight in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. Clenched fists rising from soil, painted in yellow and green, the colors of the banana skin and rebirth. Children scrawled slogans on classroom walls. "Soil is freedom. Our harvest, our future. No more kneeling." For the first time in generations, the fight for Africa's future was not about weapons or borders. It was about who controlled the building blocks of life itself. Analysts in London began whispering about a new kind of conflict: an economic soil war, fought not with armies, but with microbes, markets, and meaning. Financial newspapers ran think pieces titled "The Geopolitics of Compost" and "Can Bananas Collapse the Fertilizer Industry?" And beneath the noise, one truth settled like dust after a storm. Every hectare of land revived by a buried banana was more than fertile ground. It was a battlefield won. "If freedom can be planted," Ibrahim Traoré said in a rare interview with a Senegalese journalist, "then let the world fear its harvest." Because when the desert began to bloom, it was not just crops that were rising. It was Africa itself. New York, September 2025. The United Nations General Assembly had heard its share of grand speeches, pleas for aid, promises of reform, declarations of peace that never quite arrived. But that morning, something different stirred beneath the hall's marble calm. When Ibrahim Traoré's representative, the Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, walked to the podium, there were no folders, no entourage of advisors, no teleprompter glowing with prepared remarks. He carried only the weight of a message that had traveled from the Sahel to the world stage. The hall fell quiet. For 60 years, he began, his voice soft but unwavering. We were told to beg for what already lies beneath our feet. We were told to import growth, to rent our future, to trade our dignity for donations. He paused, letting the words settle into the silence. Today, we say the aid era is over. A gasp rippled through the delegates. Cameras zoomed in. Journalists sat forward in their seats. This was not the language of diplomacy. This was the language of rupture. When we buried 100 tons of bananas in the Sahel, he continued, his tone gaining strength, the world laughed. They called us mad. They said we were wasting food while our children starved. But we were not burying food. We were burying dependence. We were planting freedom. The representative gestured to a small vial on the podium. Soil from the Sahel, the color of rust, the weight of history. Though he did not pour it as the stories would later claim, the symbolism was clear. This, he said, holding it up for all to see, is what your world calls poor. But this dust grows life if we let it. This soil feeds our people without a single imported bag of fertilizer. This earth is our sovereignty, not gold, not oil, but soil. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded slowly, their faces thoughtful. A few, representatives from Ghana, Senegal, and Mali, applauded openly, breaking protocol. The speech continued for 12 minutes, each sentence a hammer strike against the architecture of dependency. He spoke of farmers who had learned to trust their land again, of children singing new songs in fields that had been dead, of a nation that had chosen dignity over donations. And he ended with a challenge. We invite the world not to give us aid, but to give us respect. Not to send us fertilizer, but to learn from our soil. Because what grows in Burkina Faso today is not just millet and sorghum. It is proof that freedom can bloom even in dust. The hall erupted. Some delegates stood and applauded. Others sat in stony silence. Western ambassadors exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral. But in the public gallery, where students and activists had crowded in to watch, the reaction was unrestrained. They cheered, they wept, they chanted, "Soil is freedom! Soil is freedom!" Outside the assembly hall, the speech went viral within minutes. Clips circulated on social media with hashtags like Banana Revolution, Soil Sovereignty, and hashtag Traoré at UN. News outlets from Johannesburg to Jakarta replayed the moment. Headlines split along ideological fault lines. Sankara Reborn, Burkina Faso's defiant UN address, read one African daily. The rebel president, Traoré, declares war on aid, warned a European daily. But for millions watching across Africa, it was more than a performance. It was permission. A continent that had once asked for help was now demanding respect. A people who had been told they could not feed themselves were proving the world wrong, one buried banana at a time. And as the speech echoed through conference rooms, university halls, and village squares, one question hung over the assembly like a prophecy. If the aid era is over, what new era has just begun? What began as a single act of defiance, 100 tons of bananas buried beneath the Sahel, refused to stay buried. Within months, the idea had leapt across borders like pollen on the wind. From Mali to Niger, from Senegal to Ghana, scientists, students, and farmers began their own experiments, turning waste into renewal, compost into courage. They called it Biofertile Africa, a grassroots revolution that no one had ordered and no one could stop. In Bamako, university students painted murals of yellow fists breaking chains. Beneath them, the words, "Composting Colonialism." In Accra, agricultural cooperatives hosted public festivals where families buried fruit peels as symbols of rebirth, planting seeds in soil enriched by their own waste. In Niamey, school children sang the song that had become an anthem across the Sahel. We feed the soil so the soil can feed us. The banana, once a punchline in Western newspapers, had become a banner. Even policy was shifting. Regional ministries began drafting the Sahel Soil Pact, a landmark agreement to replace foreign fertilizer imports with indigenous organic methods. Analysts projected that if just 20% of West African farmland adopted such techniques, the region could save over $4 billion annually. Money that could build schools, solar grids, and irrigation systems rather than enrich foreign corporations. In village markets, merchants who had once mocked Project Green Pulse now sold sacks of Sahelian compost marked with a golden banana logo. Each purchase was not merely a transaction, it was a vote, a declaration, a choice. And something subtler was changing too. A shared psychology, a moral shift. For generations, Africans had been told that their salvation would come from elsewhere, from aid programs, from loans, from the benevolence of the powerful.
Now that narrative was cracking, and a new one was taking its place. If the soil can be revived, so can we. Reporters began calling it the Banana Revolution. When asked whether he accepted the title, Ibrahim Traoré simply smiled. Revolution is a word for those who watch from afar, he said. For us, it is just work. Even as Western lobbyists pushed for trade restrictions and credit downgrades, the movement only grew. Mali launched cassava compost trials in its southern provinces. Niger tested fish waste biofertilizer along the Niger River. Ghana opened its first school of regenerative agriculture in Kumasi, with a curriculum designed around organic soil restoration. Economists began to notice something remarkable. Each time a nation cut fertilizer imports, its currency stabilized. Each time a farmer used compost instead of chemicals, rural debt fell. Independence, it turns out, had an economic formula. The ripple reached even further. Environmental think tanks in Europe published cautious studies on the Sahel model, calling it a viable frontier for sustainable intensification. NGOs that had once championed chemical inputs quietly revised their recommendations. And in Washington, a late-night talk show host, half joking, half serious, asked his audience, "What if the next green revolution comes from a banana peel?" But in the Sahel, no one was joking anymore. Across the dusk horizon, fields once barren now shimmered green under the orange sky. Children chased goats between rows of millet that had not existed a year ago. Farmers who had once knelt in desperation now knelt in gratitude, their hands pressed to soil that smelled of rain and promise. And everywhere, you could hear a new kind of prayer, not begging for aid, but giving thanks for rebirth. "Once we begged for fertilizer," said an old farmer in Kaya, his voice steady as he scattered seeds into dark earth. "Now we sell it." The revolution had outgrown its author. It was no longer Ibrahim Traoré's project. It was no longer even Burkina Faso's story. It had become Africa's memory and its future, a reminder that sovereignty does not arrive in envelopes, but grows from the ground. And as the Sahel wind swept over the reborn fields, carrying the scent of soil and sweetness, one truth whispered louder than all the speeches in New York. You can bury fruit, you can bury faith, but you cannot bury an idea whose time has come. Night falls over the Sahel. The wind that once carried dust now carries the smell of life. Wet soil, ripening fruit, and smoke from cooking fires. Somewhere in the dark, a farmer kneels, pressing his fingers into the earth. It crumbles, rich and black between his hands. He smiles. Your father once begged for fertilizer, he tells his young son, who stands beside him holding a water jug. You will sell it. In that single sentence lies an entire revolution. Project Green Pulse was never just about agriculture. It was about dignity, about a continent learning to believe again in what it already possessed. In a world where everything is bought and borrowed, Burkina Faso proved that some things must be grown, not given. The buried bananas have long since disappeared, decomposed into the soil they were meant to save. But their meaning has not. Beneath the Sahel sands, a new story is taking root, one where dependence gives way to creation, where the simplest act of nurturing the land becomes an act of defiance, where a nation's sovereignty is measured not in gold reserves or military might, but in the richness of its soil. And perhaps that is the real lesson of Ibrahim Traoré's experiment. Freedom does not fall from the sky. It rises from the ground. When future generations walk across these fields, fields that are green now, that feed families and fuel economies, they may not remember the speeches or the headlines or even the name Project Green Pulse, but they will eat from the soil that once refused to die. They will understand that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to plant. They called it madness, Ibrahim Traoré said once in a quiet moment after the cameras had stopped rolling. But if madness can make the desert bloom, maybe the world needs a little more of it. Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an episode of history. It is a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive, waiting to be claimed. If this message has moved you, then subscribe to this channel. Not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored and where stories of pride continue to be told. By subscribing, you are not just supporting us. You are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding story. One Nation Africa is not just a channel. It is a gathering of those who still believe that freedom can bloom even in dust.
The statistics tell one story. 2,000 acres transformed, fertilizer imports cut by 30%, soil fertility up 60%, $4 billion saved across West Africa. These are the numbers that economists will cite, the data that policymakers will study. But the real story is in the soil itself, in the hands of farmers who have learned to trust the earth again, in the songs of children who plant banana peels and sing of harvest to come, in the quiet pride of a nation that chose dignity over donations, autonomy over aid. Ibrahim Traoré once said, "Our soil is our first army," and he was right. Because when a people can feed themselves, when they can nurture life from their own land without asking permission, they become unconquerable. The experiment in Burkina Faso was never about bananas. It was about belief. The belief that Africa does not need to be saved, only trusted. That its people do not need charity, only the freedom to cultivate what has always been theirs. And as the sun sets over fields that were once desert, as green shoots push through soil that was once declared dead, as farmers harvest crops from land that experts said would never yield again, one truth becomes undeniable. The aid era is not ending because Africa was abandoned. It is ending because Africa chose to walk away. And in that choice lies the seed of every revolution still to come. If this story stirred something in you, a question, a spark, a belief in what is possible, share it. Comment below. Soil is freedom. Show the world you still believe in what can grow from the ground. The revolution will not be televised. It will be cultivated, one buried banana at a time.